Welcome to the seventh episode of our show, The Second Sex. We're exploring Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking work and its lasting impact.
Great to be diving in again.
Today, we're really digging into Chapter 2 of history, specifically pages 101 through 116. The goal here is to unpack how Beauvoir saw humanity historically defining and, well, treating women.
Absolutely. And these pages are foundational, really. She's tracing the roots, trying to understand how these power dynamics, this idea of woman as other, even began. It's about those earliest social structures.
Okay, so where does she start? She kicks off with the primitive horde, arguing that the basic sort of biological and economic situation back then led to male supremacy. What's the core idea there?
Well, her central point is that the very first division of labor, which was, pretty much driven by biology, women bearing children, had these massive consequences down the line.
Consequences, how?
She suggests woman's role was so tied up with reproduction with the species itself that she became, in Beauvoir's words, prey to the species. Man, on the other hand, started using tools.
The tools.
Right. And the tool lets him engage with the world differently. He's shaping it, changing it. It's about projects. Woman's connection is more internal, linked to her body, to motherhood.
So the tool represents a kind of active shaping of the world versus the more cyclical nature of life-giving.
Exactly. And here's a really key bit. Beauvoir says humanity's special thing is this drive for transcendence, questioning our existence, looking for meaning beyond just staying alive.
Okay.
And she thinks this led man to value his active engagement, his projects, more highly than the life-giving role associated with women. This valuing, this distinction, allowed him to position himself as the one who creates value, as the master.
Right, so his activity creates values, and that somehow trumps the indistinct forces of life, as she puts it, leading him to subjugate nature and woman along with it.
Precisely. It's like by acting on the world, man starts to see himself as separate from nature, maybe even above it. And since woman is associated so strongly with biological processes, with nature,
He gets lumped in with nature as something to be mastered.
that's the idea. It establishes this fundamental duality. And the one who gets to define the terms of that duality, well, they hold the power. Which brings us straight to her concept of the same and the other.
Okay, explain that. She says man inherently thinks in these dualities. How does woman become the quintessential other?
Well, for Beauvoir, man naturally sets himself up as the same, the default, the subject, the absolute. Anything or anyone different from that default becomes other.
And woman is obviously different biologically.
Exactly, especially her reproductive role. So she's immediately slotted into that other category relative to the male same. It's not necessarily conscious malice, she suggests, but a basic cognitive pattern with huge implications.
So it's about who sets the terms. Man is the norm, woman is defined by her difference from that norm.
Pretty much, yeah. And while maybe super early on, the other could be lots of things, maybe even male and female cosmic forces like in some old myths.
Like the Babylonian example she gives.
Right. But she argues that as societies developed, woman got increasingly pushed into and confined within that other category, especially as her role in creating life became paradoxically more central to how society thought about her.
Which seems to lead into the next phase, the rise of these powerful feminine divinities, the fertility goddesses. It feels a bit contradictory, doesn't it? If patriarchy is the trend, why this period of apparently powerful female gods?
It is fascinating, and Beauvoir has a specific take. It makes sense, right? In early societies, where life comes from is a huge mystery, a vital necessity. So you get these powerful goddesses linked to fertility, to life itself. We see the evidence those figures found in Susa and Crete, she mentions.
The great goddess figures, what were they like?
Quite varied, actually. Some very full-figured, emphasizing motherhood, others slimmer, clothed, naked. Their symbols are all over the place, too. Doves for heaven, serpents for the underworld. They were linked strongly to nature, mountains, forests, water.
So embodying both the life-giving side and maybe the unpredictable, dangerous side of nature, too.
Exactly that. Beauvoir describes them as holding power over life and death, often seen as fickle, even dangerous like nature itself. Think Ishtar, Astarte, Cybele, Isis. These figures held real sway across large regions.
And male gods were sometimes secondary.
In that era, often yes. But, and this is absolutely crucial to Beauvoir's argument, even when these goddesses seemed all-powerful, the way they were understood, the framework of their worship, she argues, was still largely shaped by men.
Ah, okay. That's a really important subtlety. So the reverence was there, but the interpretation, the meaning assigned was still male-driven.
That's her point, which connects to the idea of woman being seen as both sacred and taboo. How do those fit together?
Well, the power, the mystery around birth, it sets them apart, makes them sacred maybe.
Yes, their sacredness, tied to that miracle of life, also made them subject to taboos, like anything powerful and mysterious. They were seen as having special powers, maybe magic, sorcery.
So potentially healers or witches.
Right. And we see hints of them in religious roles, like priestesses among the Druids, she notes. Sometimes even a limited role in tribal councils or leadership.
So respected, maybe even feared, but still separate.
Exactly. But Beauvoir is clear. This perceived power, the sacred status, didn't equal real social or political power. And then comes the big shift, the move towards patriarchal society. She emphasizes it wasn't overnight, it was gradual, complex.
She talks about family and clan structures changing. How did that play into it?
She looks at how kinship worked, marriage customs, economic stuff like buying wives or dowries. But a key thing she points to is men becoming more aware of themselves as individuals, and crucially, developing a stronger connection to their own sons rather than, say, their sister's sons for inheritance and lineage.
So the direct male line becomes more important.
Yes. And as men develop this stronger sense of self, of their own will and agency, she argues society has just naturally gravitated towards patriarchal structures. And she really hammers this home even when men seemed awestruck or confused by the mysteries of life, nature, woman. They never actually gave up their position as the ones doing the defining, the ones in control.
Even when they were worshiping goddesses or seemed intimidated by women's perceived magic.
Precisely. Even when they posited woman as essential, as powerful in her own way, it was he who was doing the positing. He defines her role, and in doing so, reaffirms his own role as the primary subject, the definer. Despite her fertility, he remains her master, just like he sees himself mastering the fertile earth.
So the prestige women had, even during the goddess era, was sort of granted by men through a male filter.
That's Beauvoir's argument. The idols, however powerful they seem, are ultimately man's inventions, and he can ultimately destroy them. This dependence becomes clearer as male self-consciousness grows, leading to a more explicit assertion of dominance.
And from there, the subordination just gets deeper and more systemic. She gives some pretty grim examples.
She really does. Female infanticide in ancient Arabia, just stark evidence of how little female life was valued. The fact that accepting a baby girl was seen as the father being generous says it all.
Yeah, that's chilling.
And things like the stain of birth being considered greater for mothers of girls in Leviticus, needing double the purification time. Or lower blood money if a woman was killed compared to a man. It permeates everything.
Legally and socially, too.
Absolutely. Fathers had total power over daughters, and that power just transferred to the husband. Women were basically property, which, conveniently for men, justifies polygamy and the right to just dish a wife.
While women faced extreme pressure for chastity and absolute fidelity, the double standard is glaring.
Huge. She does note that some earlier, perhaps more matriarchal-leaning societies might have been a bit looser about premarital sex or even adultery for women. But under patriarchy, no way. Virgin bride, total fidelity. It was all about ensuring legitimate heirs for the man's property and lineage.
So female infidelity becomes like treason against the whole system of property and inheritance.
Exactly. And these unequal laws about adultery, they stuck around for centuries in various legal codes, consistently biased against women.
So even within the family unit, women's power was systematically chipped away.
Right. Maybe initially women kept some ties or rights through their birth clan, but as patriarchy tightened its grip, they increasingly became just the property of their father, then their husband.
Then she moves on to ancient Greece. We think of democracy, philosophy, but for women.
It was pretty restrictive, mostly confined to the home, the gynecium. Often viewed quite negatively in literature, Homer, Hesiod. That quote from Pericles about the best woman being the one least talked about tells you a lot.
But Plato was different, wasn't he? He argued for educating women, letting them participate more.
He did. He was an outlier. But his ideas were mostly laughed off. Aristophanes mocked them in his plays. The mainstream view, think Aristotle, was that women were fundamentally deficient, naturally subordinate. Xenophon depicts marriages as quite distant, women's role just running the house efficiently.
And there was quite a bit of outright misogyny in Greek writing, too.
Oh, definitely. Beauvoir points to poets like Simonides, Archilochus, really biting epigrams, attacking women for being lazy, nagging, spending too much. And the irony, if a woman did bring a big dowry, giving her maybe a tiny bit of leverage, she'd get criticized for being arrogant about it.
Okay, jumping way forward, the French Revolution. Liberty, equality, fraternity.
Hmm.
Did that extend to women?
Well, there was a moment. You had figures like Olympe de Gouges writing the Declaration of the Rights of Women, real demands for equality. But it didn't last. De Gouges was executed, the movement was
So
suppressed.
the revolution ultimately failed women.
Largely, yes. There were some small gains, equal inheritance, easier divorce, but Beauvoir calls them feeble conquests. Why? Well, bourgeois women were often too tied into the family system, economically dependent. Working women faced exploitation based on their sex. And powerful voices like Chaumette were actively pushing back, insisting women belonged in the home. The old ideas were strong.
And then the Industrial Revolution just brought new forms of exploitation.
Absolutely. Women flooded into factories, mines, terrible conditions, rock bottom pay, widespread abuse. Marx noted how supposed feminine qualities were used to justify enslaving them economically. Initially, there were even calls to keep women out of workshops because they weren't organized enough to fight back. Building women's unions, associations, that was a slow, hard fight.
It sounds like women ended up in this really contradictory position.
Totally.
Yeah.
Legally, often like minors under their husbands, but maybe a single woman had some rights. Laws about things like adultery were full of paradoxes. And Beauvoir makes an interesting point about exceptional women who did achieve great things.
Like queens or saints.
Exactly. Elizabeth, Petra, Catherine the Great, they operated primarily as sovereigns, almost beyond their gender. Same with saints like Catherine of Siena or Teresa. Their religious authority elevated them.
So they succeeded almost by not being seen primarily as women.
That's Beauvoir's implication. She argues most women, trapped by their conditions, simply couldn't make a deep mark on the world. When they did intervene, it was often indirectly conspiracies, assassinations, maybe fighting alongside men in revolutions. But when things got organized, their voices were often silenced, their influence downplayed by male historians. The real power structures, they stayed firmly in male hands.
Wow. Okay, so looking back at this whole sweep of history through Beauvoir's lens, it's a relentless picture of woman being defined as the other.
It really is. Her dive into history shows this pattern repeating again and again, defining women as different, as secondary, and the enormous consequences that flow from that.
We've seen how she connects it all, economics, biology, the way human consciousness developed, even how goddess worship ultimately didn't shift the fundamental power balance. It all seemed to pave the way for male dominance.
Which really brings up a crucial question for all of us, for you listening. How do these deep historical roots, this pattern of othering, still play out today?
Yeah, how do they shape our current ideas about gender, about power? It's worth thinking about the ways, maybe subtle, maybe not so subtle, that this dynamic might still be operating. This history gives us a powerful lens.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for exploring this chapter with us. It's dense, powerful stuff, and we definitely encourage you to go back to Beauvoir herself and keep wrestling with these ideas.